My name is Alima, and I am 64 years old. I live in Seattle, in a modest apartment overlooking a small park. It's a quiet neighborhood, peaceful in its way, though sometimes I wonder if the silence has become too familiar. My husband Omar and I have been married for nearly 40 years. Our children have grown up, moved across the country, and started their own families. They call often, and sometimes they visit. But most days it's just me, the hum of the apartment, and the rhythm of my daily prayers. Omar travels frequently for work. He's a respected scholar in our community, often invited to lead seminars or speak at conferences. I'm proud of his accomplishments, of course, but his absence has left me with long stretches of time to myself. I try to fill the days with purpose, reading, cooking, volunteering at the mosque. But there are moments when the hours stretch too long, and I find myself yearning for something I can't quite name. Life has a way of settling into a pattern as you grow older. For years, I've told myself that this is how it's meant to be. Calm, predictable, safe. And yet, there's a part of me that remembers what it felt like to be young, to feel the rush of excitement and possibility. I've buried that part of myself under the weight of responsibility and routine, but every now and then it stirs, reminding me that it's still there. One rainy afternoon, as I sat by the window watching the drops streak down the glass, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Omar's cousin in Chicago, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. The message was brief, but unexpected. Salam, Alima. My son Kareem is traveling through Seattle for a few days. Would it be possible for him to stay with you while he's in town? I hesitated for a moment, the idea of having a guest in the house catching me off guard. But it felt rude to refuse, and besides, it might be nice to have company for a change. Of course, I replied. He's welcome to stay. The next evening, Kareem arrived. I opened the door to find a young man standing on the threshold, his travel bag slung over one shoulder. He was tall, with broad shoulders and an athletic build that hinted at a life of activity and strength. His skin was a rich, warm brown, and his dark eyes held a quiet confidence. "Assalamu alaikum, auntie," he said, his voice deep but gentle. "Wa alaikum assalam," I replied, smiling as I stepped aside to let him in. Kareem was polite and soft-spoken, with a charm that was impossible to ignore. Over dinner, he told me about his studies, his plans to start a business someday, and the travels that had brought him to Seattle. He spoke with a passion and energy that reminded me of the excitement I used to feel in my youth. As the evening wore on, I found myself watching him more closely than I intended. The way he gestured as he spoke, the warmth in his smile, the strength in his hands as he lifted his glass. It all drew my attention in a way that left me unsettled. When he excused himself to shower after dinner, I found myself lingering in the living room, my thoughts racing. I told myself it was natural to admire a young man in his prime, but there was a part of me that felt guilty, as though I had already crossed an invisible line. When Kareem returned, his hair still damp from the shower, he thanked me again for letting him stay. "You've been so kind, auntie," he said, his voice soft. "It's nice to feel at home, even when I'm far from it." I smiled, but the warmth in his words stayed with me long after I went to bed that night. As I lay awake, listening to the rain tapping against the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that his arrival had stirred something inside me I hadn't felt in decades. Little did I know that feeling was only the beginning. The days with Kareem in the house were unlike anything I'd experienced in years. His presence filled the quiet spaces that had once felt so heavy, and his energy brought a vibrancy to the apartment that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. He was polite and thoughtful, always offering to help with the dishes or asking about my day. But more than that, he had a warmth that seemed to brighten every room he entered. I told myself that I was simply happy to have company. It had been so long since anyone had stayed with us, and Karim's charm made it easy to forget how empty the apartment often felt. But as the days passed, I began to notice things that left me questioning my own thoughts. It was the way his voice carried when he spoke, deep and steady, with a kind of quiet authority that made you want to listen. It was the way his shoulders moved when he carried his bag upstairs, the strength in his arms evident even in the simplest of gestures. It was the way his laughter, rich and unguarded, filled the apartment in a way that felt entirely too intimate. One evening, we sat in the living room after dinner, sipping tea and talking about his travels. He leaned back on the couch, his posture relaxed, his long legs stretched out in front of him. I couldn't help but notice the way his shirt clung to his chest, highlighting the lean muscle beneath. "I hope I'm not intruding too much, Auntie," he said, his dark eyes meeting mine. "You've been so generous letting me stay." "Not at all," I replied quickly, my voice a little too eager. "It's been nice having someone around." He smiled, a slow, disarming smile that made my heart flutter in a way I hadn't felt in years. "Well, I'm glad I can be good company," he said softly. I looked away, feeling a blush rise to my cheeks. It was ridiculous, I told myself. Karim was young, vibrant, and full of potential. He probably didn't even notice the way I seemed to hang on his every word. But later that night, as I lay in bed, I found my thoughts drifting back to him. I replayed our conversations, the way his laughter had made my chest tighten, the way his presence seemed to fill every corner of the apartment. I tried to dismiss it as harmless admiration, but there was a small, insistent part of me that knew better. The next day, Karim offered to cook dinner. "It's the least I can do after all you've done for me," he said with a grin. I agreed, curious to see him in the kitchen. He moved with an ease that was mesmerizing, his hands deft as he chopped vegetables and stirred spices into a fragrant pot of stew. "You're a natural," I said, leaning against the counter as I watched him work. He glanced at me over his shoulder, his smile playful. "My mum taught me well," he said, "but I'm sure I could still learn a thing or two from you." The way he looked at me in that moment, his eyes warm and steady, his smile lingering just a second too long, made my breath catch. I quickly turned away, busying myself with setting the table, but my hands trembled as I worked. That evening, as we sat down to eat, the atmosphere between us felt different. There was an unspoken tension, a quiet pull that neither of us acknowledged, but both seemed to feel. His gaze lingered on mine a moment longer than necessary, and I found myself watching the way his hands moved, the strength in his fingers as he passed me the bread basket. After dinner, as I was washing the dishes, Karim came up beside me, his presence so close that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Let me help," he said, reaching for the towel. I hesitated, but nodded, unable to find my voice. The air between us felt charged, every movement filled with an unspoken electricity. As his hand brushed lightly against mine while drying a plate, a spark flickered in the silence between us, catching me off guard. For the rest of the evening I kept my distance, avoiding his gaze, unsure of how to interpret the flutter in my chest. When he said goodnight, his voice calm yet warm, I couldn't help but glance up. Our eyes met briefly, and in that fleeting connection, time seemed to stand still, leaving me unsettled by the quiet intimacy of the moment. That night, as I lay in bed, my thoughts refused to quiet. Karim was a guest in our home, my husband's family, and so much younger than me. Yet, there was a growing sense of something unspoken between us, an undercurrent that neither of us had dared to name. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself that these feelings were fleeting, misplaced, and best ignored. But as the hours passed, and rain began to tap softly against the window, I couldn't help but wonder why it felt so impossible to let go. The storm outside intensified, raindrops pelting the glass with an insistent rhythm, mirroring the confusion and longing that churned inside me. When Kareem stepped closer, his presence filled the space, his warmth tangible even in the cool air. I could smell the faint trace of his cologne, clean and understated, mingling with the natural scent of him. My breath quickened, my pulse racing, though neither of us spoke. "Alima," he said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the sound of the rain. His hand hovered near mine before lightly brushing my arm. The gentle touch carried a weight I couldn't ignore, a quiet question he was waiting for me to answer. "If you want me to leave, just say so." I opened my mouth, knowing the words I should say, yet nothing came. My heart pounded as my head moved faintly in denial, an instinctive response I hadn't meant to show. "I don't know," I whispered, the words barely audible, filled with hesitation. That was all it took. Kareem stepped forward, his movements deliberate, but unhurried, closing the space between us. His arms encircled me with a firm but cautious embrace, grounding me as I felt his strength envelop me. It wasn't overwhelming, it was steady, reassuring, and yet it left me breathless all the same. He held me like I was both fragile and unshakable, his touch respectful, yet charged with unspoken emotion. When his lips met mine, the kiss was soft at first, hesitant, testing boundaries neither of us had defined. His hand rested gently at the curve of my back, a silent gesture of reassurance, as though asking if this was truly what I wanted. I found myself leaning into him, my body betraying the doubts that still lingered in my mind. The intensity grew, a quiet urgency building between us. The rain outside blurred the world beyond the windows, cocooning us in the stillness of the moment. His presence was undeniable, his every movement deliberate, yet restrained. It wasn't reckless, it was careful, each touch grounded in understanding rather than impulsivity. Kareem didn't overwhelm me. Instead, he anchored me, drawing me into a moment that felt fleeting yet profound, as though nothing existed outside the quiet storm we found ourselves in. "Alima," he murmured against my lips, his voice thick with emotion. "You're beautiful. You have no idea how much I've wanted this." His words ignited something within me, a fire that burned away the years of monotony and routine. I felt his hand slide down to my hip, gripping me firmly but not harshly, his touch commanding and full of intent. My knees weakened, and before I could process what was happening, he guided me backward toward the couch, his movements deliberate and unrelenting. "Kareem," I whispered, my voice trembling as he leaned me back against the cushions. "I've got you," he replied, his tone reassuring yet full of hunger. His hands moved to cradle my face, his thumbs brushing against my cheeks as he looked into my eyes. The intensity of his gaze was almost too much to bear, but I couldn't look away. He leaned over me, his body pressing against mine, his hands framing my shoulders as though to keep me in place. The weight of him was both comforting and overwhelming, his strength a reminder of the stark contrast between his youthful vitality and the quiet life I had grown used to. His lips trailed from my mouth to my jawline, his kisses slow and deliberate, each one leaving a trail of warmth in its wake. His hands roamed with purpose, sliding down my arms, my sides, until they rested firmly on my hips. He pulled me closer, his grip possessive, as though he was afraid to let go. "You're incredible," he whispered, his voice thick with desire. "I can't believe this is happening." Neither could I. But as his hands moved with increasing confidence, as his body pressed closer to mine, all the reasons this was wrong faded into the background. I was consumed by the moment, by the way he made me feel. Desired, alive, cherished in a way I hadn't felt in years. He shifted his weight slightly, his movements fluid and controlled, as though every action was meant to convey just how deeply he cared. His hands framed my face again, tilting it upward as his lips claimed mine once more, the kiss deepening until I could feel nothing but him. "Karim," I murmured, my hands moving instinctively to his shoulders, gripping them tightly as though to anchor myself. The strength beneath my fingers was undeniable, a testament to his youth and vitality, and it only heightened the intensity of the moment. He pulled back slightly, his breath hot against my skin as he whispered, "You're safe with me, Alima. I promise." And I believed him. In that moment, with the storm raging outside and the world beyond the apartment forgotten, I let myself surrender completely. His hands guided me, his movements deliberate yet tender, as though he was determined to make me feel every ounce of his affection. Time seemed to blur, the minutes stretching into hours as we explored the boundaries of our connection. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word felt like a revelation, peeling away the layers of restraint and reservation that had defined my life for so long. By the time the storm outside began to subside, we lay tangled together on the couch, the quiet hum of the apartment enveloping us like a cocoon. Karim's hand rested on mine, his fingers tracing lazy patterns against my skin. His gaze was soft, filled with a quiet contentment that mirrored my own. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to find the words to describe the whirlwind of emotions coursing through me. "I'm more than okay," I said finally, my voice trembling but steady. He smiled, his hand moving to cup my cheek. "You're amazing, Alima. I hope you know that." The sincerity in his words made my chest ache, and for the first time in years, I felt truly seen, truly understood. But as the reality of what had just happened began to settle in, I couldn't ignore the weight of what lay ahead. For now, though, I allowed myself to bask in the warmth of his presence, savoring the fleeting moment of connection before the world came crashing back in. The morning after the storm, the apartment felt quieter than usual. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under a pale Seattle sun. I stood by the window, holding a cup of tea, watching the city come to life. Karim was still asleep in the guest room. The events of the previous night played on a loop in my mind, every moment vivid and electric. I touched my lips absent-mindedly, as if to confirm that it had all been real. But with the light of day came a creeping sense of reality. What had happened between Karim and me was undeniable, yet it was also something that couldn't last. My life with Omar, our shared history, my role as a wife and mother, those things were still there, unchanged, waiting for me to return to them. I was so lost in my thoughts that I didn't hear Karim approach. When he spoke, his voice startled me, deep and gentle as always. "Good morning, Auntie," he said, though the way he looked at me felt far too intimate for such a formal address. I turned to find him standing in the doorway, his hair tousled, his expression soft but hesitant. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and sweatpants, yet the sight of him made my heart ache. I smiled despite myself, unable to hide the warmth that rose in my chest. "Good morning," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. He crossed the room and stood beside me, his presence steady and grounding. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We simply stood there side by side, watching the world outside the window. "Last night," he began, his voice low and deliberate. "It meant everything to me." His words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. I turned to look at him, and the sincerity in his eyes nearly undid me. "It meant a lot to me too," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But Karim, We can't pretend this isn't complicated. I know, he said, his gaze never leaving mine. But I don't regret it. Do you? The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. Regret wasn't the right word for what I was feeling. What had happened between us was beautiful, but it was also fleeting. Something that couldn't exist beyond the confines of these walls. I don't regret it, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. But I don't know how to move forward from here. Karim reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was light, tentative, but it sent a familiar warmth through me. I don't want to make things harder for you, he said softly. I know my time here is almost up. The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy blanket. I had known from the beginning that Karim's stay in Seattle was temporary, that he would leave once his business here was finished. But hearing him say it out loud made it feel real in a way it hadn't before. When do you leave? I asked, my voice cracking. Tomorrow, he said, his tone apologetic. I have to catch a flight back to Chicago in the evening. I nodded, my chest tightening. Tomorrow. The word felt like a ticking clock, a countdown to the end of something I wasn't ready to let go of. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Karim and I moved around each other carefully, our conversations light and casual, as though we were both trying to preserve the illusion of normalcy. But every glance, every accidental touch, carried an undercurrent of emotion that neither of us could ignore. That evening, as we sat down to dinner, the atmosphere between us was heavy with unspoken words. I had made one of Karim's favorite dishes, a lentil stew he had mentioned missing from his childhood, but the food sat mostly untouched on our plates. You've been so kind to me, Auntie, he said suddenly, breaking the silence. I don't think I've ever felt as welcome anywhere as I have here. I smiled, though it felt bittersweet. You've been wonderful company, Karim. It's been a long time since this apartment has felt so alive. His gaze softened, and for a moment, I thought he might reach for my hand. But he didn't. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. I'll miss you, he said quietly. The simplicity of his words brought tears to my eyes. I'll miss you too, I replied, my voice trembling. After dinner, we lingered in the living room, neither of us ready to say goodnight. The tension between us was palpable, but it was tinged with a sadness that hadn't been there before. Karim, I said finally, my voice breaking the silence. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, he replied, his tone steady but gentle. I just want you to know how much you mean to me. I looked at him, my heart aching. You mean a lot to me too, more than I can put into words. He smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Then let's not ruin it with words. Let's just be. We sat together in silence after that, the quiet of the apartment wrapping around us like a cocoon. I wanted to reach out to him, to hold on to him for just a little longer, but I knew that doing so would only make his departure harder. The next morning I helped him pack. The act was simple, almost mundane, yet it carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Every item he folded into his suitcase felt like a goodbye, a piece of him I would never get back. When it was time for him to leave, he stood by the door with his bag slung over his shoulder. Thank you for everything, Auntie, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Take care of yourself, Karim, I replied, my own voice trembling. He hesitated for a moment, as though he wanted to say more. But instead, he leaned in and kissed my cheek, his lips lingering just a second too long. Goodbye, he whispered, and then he was gone. The apartment felt impossibly quiet after he left, the echoes of his presence lingering in every corner. I found myself standing by the window, watching the street below, as though he might come back. But of course he didn't. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to return to my routine. I cooked, I cleaned, I prayed, and I waited for Omar to return from his latest seminar. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, my thoughts always drifted back to Kareem. His voice, his smile, the way he had made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I knew our time together was over, that it could never be anything more than a memory. But even as I told myself to move on, I couldn't help but ache for the connection we had shared. And so, I waited for the ache to fade, for the memories to soften. But deep down, I knew that a part of me would always miss him, always carry the weight of what we had shared. Because for a brief, fleeting moment, Kareem had reminded me of something I thought I had lost forever: the ability to feel deeply, to love fiercely, and to live fully. After Kareem left, the days returned to their predictable rhythm: quiet mornings, endless afternoons, and evenings filled with the sound of Omar's television programs echoing through the apartment. But something had shifted deep within me, something I couldn't ignore or suppress. Kareem's departure had left an ache, a void I hadn't expected. But more than that, it had awakened a part of me I thought had long since died. I had spent decades living for others: my husband, my children, my community. Yet in those fleeting days with Kareem, I had felt something entirely my own. A spark of life, of passion, of freedom. At first, I tried to bury the memories, to smother the fire that had been ignited within me. But the more I tried to return to my old routines, the more restless I became. Every time Omar left for another seminar or conference, I found myself staring at the empty apartment, the quiet suffocating me. And then it happened again. It started innocently enough: a conversation at the mosque with a younger man who was new to the community. His name was Amir, and he had a warm smile and an easy way of making people feel seen. He asked me for advice about the city, about navigating life in Seattle as someone new. I offered to help, feeling the same kindness that had once made me welcome Kareem into my home. But as our conversations grew longer, as his glances lingered, I felt that same spark I had with Kareem, the same pull, the same undeniable connection. And before I could stop myself, I was standing too close, smiling too often, saying yes to his offers to meet for coffee or walk through the park. It didn't take long before the boundaries blurred. With Amir, I felt the same rush of vitality, the same exhilarating sense of being alive. It wasn't about replacing Kareem. It was about rediscovering myself, reclaiming the parts of me I had buried for so long. Each encounter felt like a small rebellion against the life I had resigned myself to, a life of quiet compromise and fading passions. With Amir and others who followed, I found myself stepping into a world I had never allowed myself to imagine. A world where I wasn't just a wife, a mother, or a homemaker. I was a woman. The guilt came in waves, ebbing and flowing with each passing day. I prayed for forgiveness, for clarity, for strength. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to stop. Each new connection, each new moment of intimacy, reminded me of what it meant to be seen, desired, and alive. Omar remained oblivious, his attention always elsewhere, on his seminars, his books, his endless TV shows. And in the quiet spaces he left behind, I found a version of myself I hadn't seen in decades. I knew it couldn't last forever. Secrets have a way of catching up with you, and the double life I had begun to lead was a fragile thing, balanced precariously on the edge of discovery. But for now, in the quiet moments between the chaos, I allowed myself to savor the freedom, the thrill, and the connection I had thought I would never feel again. For the first time in years, I wasn't just existing. I was living. And no matter what the future held, I knew I could never go back to the woman I had been before.